Welcome to the Season 3 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar and is presented by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from the rural India. India's green energy landscape has witnessed remarkable growth and transformation in recent years, positioning the country as a global leader in the clean energy transition. With a growing population, rapid urbanization, and rising energy demands, India recognized the need to diversify its energy sources and reduce its heavy reliance on fossil fuels. In order to understand the changing landscape of the green energy sector and the country's ambitious energy transition goals, we interviewed Mr. Srivatsan Iyer, Global CEO of Hero Future Energies. He has held executive roles in ExxonMobil, Braskem and McKinsey Company and have successfully expanded their business to other countries.
Thank you so much, Mr. Iyer, for joining us here at the India Energy Hour. We are very delighted to have you here. We have had several discussions on the Indian renewable energy sector, obviously, because this podcast focuses on India's energy transition, its climate goals, and everything. But as it happens with every new and budding sector, something or the else keeps happening in it. So I thought that as the sector changes its phase, in 10 years, it has come from 2 gigawatt of solar and some barely 15, 20 gigawatt of wind to, you can see where we stand right now. We are aiming at 500 gigawatt of renewable energy in the coming years. And also the whole industry landscape has also changed. You have come into the sector, I must say, at a very right and a vibrant time. And you have come with an outsider view, and now you're pretty much an insider, working with one of the leading companies in the sector. So I thought that it would be great to have you to speak with us here today.
Very good. Thanks for having me. Enjoy our conversation and look forward to having, I'd say, a more in-depth conversation on where India's energy transition is going.
Great. But before we get into that, I believe I and also our listeners want to know a little bit about your journey. Where are you from? I know you have shifted countries, you have changed sectors, and you're here in this green energy sector. What brought you into this sector, first of all, and where are you from? What did you study? Just tell us about yourself, please.
Sure. So starting almost at the beginning, because I think it makes more sense. By training, I'm a chemical engineer. So I finished my studies here in India in 1990, and I moved to the US for graduate studies. Spent some time, getting masters and PhD, and I started working for ExxonMobil back in 97 in R&D and research on chemicals and plastics. Moved to a business focused role or business development type role. Got my MBA along the way while I was still working. And right after that, I switched to business consulting. I joined McKinsey in Houston in the US and spent 5 years with them working primarily in the energy and chemical sector. And when I say energy, it was almost all hydrocarbon energy, oil and gas, electric power, but based on hydrocarbons. And I spent time in various geographies as a consultant in India, in China, in Canada. I had almost a year and a half or 2 years in Brazil, and the rest of it consulting with clients in the US. Post that, I actually joined one of my clients, which was a large chemical company based out of Brazil that I had consulted for. I joined them in 2010 when they had just moved into the US through an acquisition. And I stayed with them for 10 years, spent time. Started obviously with them in the US, went and spent 3 years in Germany with the same company. And right after Germany, I was, I'd say, what I describe as expat light. In other words, my family was in the US, but I was working in Brazil. So I was going back and forth, spent about 3 years doing that. And of course, that was about the time COVID hit and, everybody was working out of home. And for those of you, I guess, who are not very aware of the petrochemical industry, 100% of the economics of petrochemicals depends on oil and gas. So we spent quite a bit of time from 2017 on looking at what was happening in the world of energy transition, especially looking at solar and wind, looking at electric vehicles and what that was going to do eventually to oil and gas demand globally. And that kind of piqued my interest in what was happening in energy transition, and spent, of course, time looking at that outside in, not as part of the industry clearly, but clearly the implications are enormous for all sectors outside of renewables as well. That was the time this opportunity came by to join Hero Future Energies, which seemed intriguing because I had spent 30 some years in the US, Germany, Brazil, but I'd never actually worked in India. So I left India in 1990 and I've never actually worked there at all. The time I spent there was living there was really just as a student. So it was a sector that was intriguing. It was a country that was intriguing, and I say intriguing because India is really on the cusp of tremendous growth in all fields of economic activity. So it seemed to be the perfect time to shift country and shift sector, both of which are on the verge of takeoff. And so I joined with, I'd say, a fairly superficial knowledge of renewable energy, other than knowing that it was growing all over the world and it was going to have a major impact. And so that's how my journey started about 2 years back. And you started off by introducing me as an insider. I still feel like a rookie. I still feel like I learn something every day about the sector. And I'm glad to have a wonderful team at Hero Future Energies of industry veterans. Some of them have spent, a couple of decades in the India power sector. Some of them have spent a decade plus in renewable energy. And they teach me every day, right? So I'm fortunate to have a team around me that knows a whole lot more about the sector than I do.
I have a quick kind of light follow-up before we, kind of get into other stuff. With you, having spent so much time in the petrochemical and the fossil fuel sort of sectors, you jumping to the renewable side of it, is this a trend that global executives are jumping ship from the fossil fuel side of the story to the renewable side of the story, or it's just your one-off kind of story?
I think for fossil fuel to renewables, I can't think of very many examples. But if you think of people who are expats, who are moving into India after having spent the bulk of their working career outside of India, that seems to have become fairly common. And, I like to think of myself as one of the few, but as I spend more and more time, I know there's many, many companies that are doing that, both in conventional as well as in the renewable energy space, right? They're bringing in people from outside of India with experience either in renewables or in other sectors as well. Now, the move from oil and gas to renewables, clearly the big oil majors have kind of been moving in that direction for, about, I'd say, close to a decade now. Shell, BP, Total. And what they've done is clearly take their talent pool and move people from their conventional energy to renewable energy. But the world of renewable energy IPPs, I think, is still primarily made up of people who grew up in the conventional power sector, whether it's coal or what have you, and then transferred them or transitioned them to the renewable energy sector. You guys probably have a wider view of how the IPP sector in India is. I'm not sure there's very many other people who have moved from oil and gas into renewables the way I did, but there may be a few other examples. But I do know, other companies in India are hiring expats with, let's say, different backgrounds into the renewable energy space in India.
So a great note to kick into our topic of the day. Good that you started the thing that there's a lot of change happening. A lot of companies are hiring expats and widening their expertise. Before we get into how the sector is changing, there's this very interesting point that you yourself said in an interaction, and I believe you've said that quite many times, that plain vanilla solar and wind is not of any use in this country anymore. I might be saying it in a very rudimentary language, but plain vanilla solar and wind is something that does not excite major players anymore. Can you elaborate on that? What are the reasons that have led to it? And what exactly is the business case of plain vanilla solar and wind, and why it doesn't work anymore?
I think there's two primary reasons. One is the more you build a plain vanilla solar and wind, the more intermittent you make the entire system as a whole, right? So you actually accentuate the disparity between the times when they're generating and the time when demand is actually required in the market, right? So on the one hand, you look at that and say, I keep building it up to a point, yes, but then beyond a point, it actually doesn't help contribute to a solution, but it might create a problem. So I think that's really part one. Part two is like every other industry, like every other sector, plain vanilla solar and wind have become commoditized, right? It's a pure cost game now. Provided you have access to the right resource, which is the land with the right radiation or, the land corresponding to the high wind speed, everybody has this more or less the same capabilities, the same skills, and they beat the tariffs down to, what I call bare bone levels, right? So to a point where some players, I would argue, may not even cover their cost of capital, right? So I guess in a race to add capacity, one has to question whether the returns are even worth bidding in that case, right? So the economic case is not as strong. And secondly, the future of the electrical system in any country, and especially in India, is not dependent on plain vanilla solar and wind anymore. Do we continue to have to build those? Yes, we do, up to a point. But I think in the future, to make the grid more robust and to make sure that we can actually get round-the-clock power, we have to look at different technologies, whether it's hybrid with storage, whether it's short-duration storage or long-duration storage, whether it's a peak power or load following. But these are the new types that have to come up just to meet the demand pattern over a 24-hour period, over a 365-day period, right? So I think that's why you see more and more IPPs kind of shifting, because if you look at the new SECI trend, right, of bids, even they're moving in that direction, right? So the plain vanilla is still there, but certainly they're emphasizing a lot more of these, which is really needed, A, to meet the demand, and B, to make sure that the grid is still robust.
So on that, I have a follow-up. I mean, is there really a business case for hybrid or round-the-clock RE at this point? If I understand it correctly, the cost of capital is the main initial investment that goes into any RE project. So now if you're installing both, let's say solar and wind together, won't the cost of capital be even higher? And linked to that is, our consumers, I mean, whether it's industrial or, household consumers, are they willing to pay more, this is like an investment into the grid and into the future, right? So do you think there is a business case, and then whether people will be willing to pay a bit more to accept that kind of hybrid power?
No, so let me split the two questions. Let's just talk about plain hybrid, and then we'll talk about hybrid plus storage. Now, if you talk about just pure hybrid, the capex is more, but the tariff is still very competitive. And in the end, you have to compare your tariffs to the cost of the next best alternative, right? And if you look at the marginal cost of power production in India, for example, it's probably thermal generation that's dispatchable power, most likely based on imported coal, right? Now, I may be stretching it a bit, but the marginal cost of that on a dispatchable basis is actually very high. So if you were to come in at a pure hybrid, which is solar plus wind, which gives you a higher CUF, and it's not going to be round the clock, for example, but certainly covers more hours than just either a pure wind or a pure hybrid, you're still competitive. I'd rather still pay for hybrid based, even though the capex is high, because the tariffs are still going to be lower than coal. But those tariffs will still give you a good return on the capital invested. So let's go to the next question. What if I need to expand that and make sure that I can cover my peak power needs, evening needs, for example, or if I need to do around the clock, right? That's when storage has to come in. Now, whether that storage is a long duration energy storage like pumped hydro, whether it's a short duration peak power storage like battery, it's different. There, the tariffs are going to be a little higher. I would say relative to the marginal cost, they're still not that bad. They're kind of on parity, but the main thing to remember is that the cost of storage is actually declining, let's call it about 15% a year almost, right? And that's the trend over the last 15 years. And that's been the trend for solar PV modules as well. So there's no reason to believe battery storage won't continue that trajectory, to a point where solar plus wind plus battery storage, or solar plus wind plus pumped hydro, for a peak power around the clock would still be a lower tariff than a dispatchable coal-based, or God forbid in some countries, natural gas-based power, right? So economics are still favorable. Now the capex is higher, but then the tariffs will be higher, but as long as they're lower than my next best alternative, it's economically feasible to invest the capital and still get a healthy return.
Just trying to summarize the last two of your answers. You said that, obviously it makes sense to go for hybrid and hybrid plus a storage, but you said that in some way, plain solar and wind might also be needed. So, but given that we are running into hybrid, we're looking at solar plus wind plus storage. There are also RE plus thermal also being planned in some cases. But that increases the level of challenges that the sector already faces. Storage being one of the biggest challenges. You can address solar separately, but it also accentuates the challenges that the sector faces when you start merging technology, merging energy sources. So as an IPP, what is the risk-reward ratio in hybrid?
Yeah. So there's two types of challenges, right? One is the challenge to the IPP in designing the appropriate combination of solar, wind, and storage to be able to meet the needs at the lowest possible capex, right? So in other words, I want to maximize the amount I supply to the grid at the least possible capex. The other is the overall challenge to the whole grid system, right, as a whole. Now, the more storage I put, I would argue actually it's better for the overall grid system, right? Because it gives a certain amount of predictability to the grid. And I don't think India is too far behind when large battery storage projects will start to provide ancillary services to the grid as well in terms of voltage or frequency regulation and so on. I think that those days are coming. Those are already there in Western Europe, for example, in the UK, where providing the ancillary services is a revenue stream. And India, it will come to. And I think the next possible evolution in India now, I don't know, I'm just projecting or predicting what might happen, is you could see a more natural evolution to time of day tariff differentiation, right? And that is the time then I think role of battery storage becomes that much more important, right? Now, pricing is actually a very valuable tool to moderate demand, right? Today, as consumers, whether I'm industrial or sitting at home, I have no incentive to reduce my power consumption any time of the day. Right? For me, I'm indifferent, right? When you start getting time of day, people are going to be a little more wary in terms of, when do I charge my car? When do I charge my phone? When do I, turn on the appliances and so on? Because the peak power really is a way to also moderate demand, right? And make people a little more careful in terms of how much power they consume, which brings down the demand at peak hours and, moderates it a little more across the day as well. So if India evolves in that direction, then you'll start to see a little more moderation in that as well. And so I expect to see a combination of these factors actually combined to provide, I'd say, the grid stability in India and what storage can then offer, right? What either battery storage or long duration storage like pumped hydro can offer, both in terms of providing competitive power, when I say competitive at a good tariff, but also make sure that the grid is stable.
On this note, I wanted to ask you, what is the grid maturity or preparedness for all these new technologies? Till yet, we are just the grid is currently handling just 110 gigawatt of renewable energy, which will invariably increase. And then with it will increase the instances of fluctuations and everything. Hence, the hybrid model makes sense that there's a 24-hour supply. You can peak it whenever you want. But as someone who feeds into a grid, as a company which feeds into the grid, what is your impression of the grid preparedness for these new technologies? There were plans, just addition to that, there were plans to have dedicated renewable energy management center, better forecasting, better planning. At what stage is this? Just give us a image of how the grid absorbs renewable in this country.
Yeah. So a couple of things, right? One is the overall energy demand in India, the projection is actually quite robust, right? So we're going to be consuming a whole lot more energy going forward, just on a secular basis, independent of the whole trend of electrification of vehicles, this, that, and the other, right? So just because the economy is growing and the population is growing and, they're getting to more middle class. So the grid has to, just keep up with growing demand, regardless of where the power is coming from. Whether it comes from thermal or renewable, doesn't matter. So we need grid investments, both to expand and to upgrade, right? So that's a given. Next is that demand growth going to be met? What combination of dispatchable power, and I say dispatchable, thermal, versus, I'd say, intermittent like renewable, is going to contribute to that demand growth. The good news is, I think in India, we are starting to see the roadmaps set by the Power Ministry, by CEA and so on, that recognizes that A, electricity demand growth is going to go up, and B, a larger and larger fraction. In fact, the target is 50% renewables by 2030, right? And so that's a very ambitious goal. And so the roadmap that they've set is to invest in grid expansion and grid stability in order to make that happen. And that's why I see a pivotal role for storage there as well, because you can invest in grid, but in the end, there has to be mechanisms that moderate the impact of intermittency, which literally happens from a second to the other, right? So intermittency is not, at 12 noon, the sun is shining, and, at 5 p.m., the sun sets. The intermittency is at 12 o'clock, the sun is shining, and at 12:05, a cloud moves over the sun, and your particular location, the generation literally drops significantly, right? So I'm talking intermittency literally at a minute by minute level, right? And that's where I think the role of storage is going to be really important. We can always talk about forecasting and scheduling. I'm sure the world has made leaps and strides, lots of strides in forecasting and scheduling. It's still going to be as much art as it is science, right? Now, we all forecast and schedule. India for the last 3 years has seen wind resources that have been significantly below our long-term forecasts, right? Solar, particularly in south of India and Karnataka, has been significantly below normal radiation levels over the last 3-4 years. Minute by minute or day ahead forecasting is still as much art as it is science, right? So we can't depend on improvements in forecasting and scheduling alone. We have to have mechanisms that allow for grid stability at the aggregate level. Now, clearly, the CEA is actually asking IPPs to make sure that at the individual plant level that we put in place the correct mechanisms, for example, the reactive power mechanisms, better forecasting and scheduling. And the way they incentivize that is by having these large penalties for deviations, right? But it's more important to do it at the macro level, because at individual plant level, like I said, if a cloud floats across the sun at my little location in Tumkur, right, my particular site, suddenly the generation drops, right? But as a whole, we need to make sure that happens. And battery storage is going to play a role there, because at some point, battery storage is not just going to be, I supply 2 hours peak power at night, but it's going to be when there's variability on a minute by minute basis, can the battery storage jump in and provide the necessary services to the grid to stabilize the grid? And that kind of market it's already there, for example, in the UK and in the US. I think it's a matter of time before it's there in India as well.
Great. You mentioned something, and I think that has been part of many conversations right now, is trying to move India towards time of the day pricing. I think that is perhaps going to solve many problems. So because we have, a wide variety of audiences here, first, can you just explain what that means? What is time of day pricing? And second, if India starts to implement time of day pricing, will it help renewables? Will it create more challenges? If you can explain that as well, that would be great.
Yeah. So I think time of day pricing, for example, when we buy power as a consumer, we're charged on a total consumption per month, right? And what time of the day I consume it is really not the factor, right? Now, there are exceptions in India. There are actually places where the peak power tariff is a little different from the, let's say, during the day tariff, right, or non-peak hour, but the differential is really small. The other is what I call dynamic pricing. For example, what you see in a market exchange is the power price is really set at the time at which you deliver power to the exchange, right? So if I deliver at 12 noon versus at 6 p.m., the tariff I get on the exchange is very different. And it really is a question then of supply and demand, right? What is my shortfall at peak? And what is, quote unquote, the willingness to pay at that point, right? And really, time of day is that's why it's required, because it has to be one more element to incentivize people to moderate their demand, right? Otherwise, like I said, I have no incentive as a consumer. I come in the evening, I turn all the lights on, I turn the TV on, I turn every appliance on, because I don't have to think about why am I doing that. Whereas if I were told that the tariff between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. in the evening is 2 times during the day, then I'd say, okay, some of these activities I'll try and do in the middle of the day. That way I don't have to, pay twice the tariff there. For renewables, again, I talk about the whole sector, right? It's better not just for renewables, but for the whole sector and also for grid stability. If there's a little more moderation in terms of what the demand is during the day, and there's a little more predictability in terms of what people are going to do. Now, time of day tariff does not take out peak hours. Peak hours is still there, and you'll see that in every mature market. It just moderates it a little more, right, and makes it a little more predictable, as opposed to I'm not using that as a tool to moderate people's behaviors, right? So I think it'll help the entire sector. I don't see necessarily it is this benefiting the RE sector, and you mentioned, but I think it benefits the power sector as well as the grid, right? And because that way you don't put undue stress on the grid every evening at 6 p.m., right? Which is what we see in a lot of places.
And I'd like to change the gear of the conversation here a little bit. This is my observations as a trend. You can disagree as well. But I'm seeing all around that major renewable energy companies in India, either Indian companies or foreign companies operating in India, are not just solar and wind energy companies anymore. They are kind of building a supply chain of their own. Someone's getting into manufacturing, battery, some are building transmission, or some are doing all of it possible. So why do you think this shift is happening? I know self-reliance is a very key business mantra, especially for a newer industry like this. But have there been some harsh lessons on the way, vis-a-vis especially manufacturing, availability of domestic local content did that lead to it? And what kind of business sense does it make for this shift to happen?
No, great question. So I think there's two reasons for this to happen. And the first is, as the conventional renewable energy sector got more commoditized, and actually you saw that I hope we saw the bottom of that 2.5 years back when tariffs were actually what, ₹1.99, I think. I mean, it's some unbelievably low level, right? And at that level, you barely cover costs, right? Forget about making a return on investment. And I think a lot of the IPPs looked at that and said, look, if that's the level of tariff, how do we actually create value for shareholders? How do we actually make money on the capex that we invest? And are there other places in the entire value chain? Now, if I were to break the value chain into generation, transmission, and distribution, are there other places I might be able to go into to create value? So one was driven by that, right? Are there opportunities where there is a margin to be had? And so do I want to, for example, there's transmission companies that moved into generation. There's generation companies that moved into distribution, right? So, for example, privatization of the discoms. The second is, I think the last 2 years, partly COVID-driven, but partly global supply chain issues and disruptions. There's a question of both cost and reliability, right? Can I actually get the components where I need them when I need them, right? Can I actually get the solar modules at the price that I want, but also at the time when I need them, right? And I'd say about a year and a half, that December, January timeframe, there was a massive shipping disruption. Shipping costs were almost 6x what they were under, I'd say, normal times, right? A container, was at $12,000 a container rather than $1,500, which is, let's say, more of a normal price. And that was a wake-up call to many, saying we're relying on global supply chains that is not only 30 to 60 days long, but where the price volatility can go anywhere from 1,500 to 12,000. Do I rely on that, or do I bring the supply chains closer to home? And India specifically, I think there's also this whole issue of geopolitics, right? And I'd say barriers, right? Whether they're tariff or non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers, 40% BCD, ALMM, etc. Plus the whole geopolitics of, do we want to be reliant on a China supply chain? Would we rather, is this of national interest to us and therefore we need to build here? So clearly the reason, at least in the solar module, as taking as an example, and batteries again, is we want to be self-sufficient because this is an area of national interest going forward for India. This is, in a way, it's like saying, how can I become self-sufficient in oil, right? Which you cannot. You either have the reserves underneath your ground or you don't. But in the solar and batteries, you can say, yeah, I can, right? If I build polysilicon to modules and if I build a lithium mining to batteries, I can actually build the entire value chain. And I don't have to be dependent on geopolitical constraints or supply chain barriers or, monopoly power of certain companies, right, who might control global supply chains. So I think it's a mix of all of these that is causing IPPs to go ahead and say, A, let me diversify and make money elsewhere rather than just building RE plants. B, even if I want to build RE plants, if I integrate myself, I can make sure that I get the most economical benefit of having the components, as well as supply security, as well as, I'm not at the mercy of geopolitics or global supply chain disruption. So it's a mix of everything. And that's why you've seen a lot of companies, clearly Tata and Adani were already there, but then Reliance has got into it, Renew has gotten into it right now. Avada is investing in new module capacity. And that's one of the reasons I think IPPs are looking into going that direction.
Okay, I just want to shift the conversation a little bit so we touch that before we come back on this supply chain train. We talked a lot about predominantly grid scale and solar and wind and renewables. But where does distributed renewables come into the scene? I mean, are they like the stepchild that everybody loves to talk about, but nobody really wants to focus on? Forget about Hero, but in your personal opinion, where do you see the role of distributed renewable energy, and what needs to happen? Because for a country like India, it makes so much sense for that sector to, grow. I mean, I believe it makes so much sense. You can disagree, of course, but,
It's a great question. I'll probably address it two ways, right? One is I tend to agree with you. I think distributed RE generation and potentially a year or two or three down the road, distributed generation with localized storage, I think could play an enormous role. Now, case in point in the US where you see distributed energy. In fact, I have several friends of mine who call themselves grid independent, right? In fact, some of them over an annual basis actually come out positive because they send more to the grid than they actually draw from the grid. That's because they've got rooftop solar plus battery storage. And some of them also have, an EV attached to it, right? So when the EV is attached to your house, it acts both to send power as well as to draw power, right? So, but that takes into account then millions and millions of I think the term used was prosumers, right? The producers and consumers. And at a moment's notice, they can do both, right? They both provide to the grid either services or energy and, or draw from it, right? I have a feeling that is a critical role because the days of building a giant power plant of 2.5 gigawatts in one location and then having these enormous transmission lines take it all over is one model. And that's the way the conventional thermal was built. That's the way RE is being built. And the other is to say it's distributed manufacturing. I produce energy where it's needed, when it's needed. And the challenge then is how do I take these millions of independent producers and consumers and tie it so that the grid doesn't collapse. In the US, it's a little more mature and advanced, partly driven by, I'd say, the risks involved, right? The primarily the financial and the credit risk, right? The system set up in the US is far more mature because of decades of, I'd say, the system being there to assess consumer credit risk and so on. India's got millions of rooftops, right? So whether it's homes, whether it's office buildings, whether it's flats, the top of the flats and apartment buildings, the risk on the flip side is still high, right? Can we understand the credit risk of the individual homeowner, right? Are they actually going to pay on time? Are they going to actually take care of the equipment, right? Soiling loss in India is significantly larger than in any other Western country, which means the individual homeowner or flat owner has to make sure that they actually take care of the equipment that they have, right? Because otherwise it's very hard to say, I'm going to visit 10 million homes every week to clean the modules is not a model that's easily replicable, right? But I really think the potential is enormous. And at some point, the attractive wind and solar sites in India are going to get more and more challenging to find to build the 250 megawatt plant or the 500 megawatt plant. It has to be replaced by this. The good news is the corporate sector is starting to do it. There's several corporates who are working with who are saying, first priority is build as much as I can in-house. Either rooftop, or if I have 2 acres next to my plant or 5 acres next to my plant, I'll put a 1.5 megawatt plant right there. And that's the kind of distributed generation that we're seeing driven by the corporate sector. The residential sector, I think, is still slow. The commercial sector is not thinking about it as much as we'd like. The large malls, movie theaters, hospitals, office buildings. I think they should be the next ones who kind of jump into this and say, yeah, I can probably build 500 kilowatts and no more, but it's still, economically viable. And if I were to connect it potentially 2, 3, 5 years from now to a battery storage, I can reduce my dependence on the grid, potentially at some point even give it back to the grid if necessary. I really look forward to that happening, at least C&I sector. Residential sector, I think we're still a little far from in India I think primarily for operations and credit, financial reasons, not for technical reasons.
The reasons that you're giving us makes me think that should DRE take the route of, say a scheme like Ujjwala or Saubhagya, where the government took the lead of bringing these connections or LPG cylinders to the households. Obviously, corporate and private companies had a role to play in, providing meters and, other services. But it is the government which takes the lead because then you take care of the risk that you just mentioned. Do you think that kind of model would work in DRE?
It could. Actually, it's an intriguing thought. Certainly, I think government has an important role to play there. I think the other factor, now that you bring it up, that could help is if there were a time of day tariff introduced in India, right? So people get into homes and say, man, my power bills are really silly and they're crazy high. If I could only store or generate in the evenings and store it, I can sell it back to the grid if I want to and make some money, or I don't depend on them, right? I've got enough power to last me through the evening peak hours when I need to. And so we need an economic incentive for the individual homeowner, consumer to say, I want to do it. Plus, I think the government needs to step in to mitigate what I call the individual consumer credit risk as well. So perhaps it's a combination of both.
Great. I wanted to ask you something which has been intriguing me for quite some time. This term called green molecule. On every press release that I get from green energy companies and otherwise, this green molecule seems to weigh very heavy. And this seems to be like part of big plans that the green energy companies are getting into. I understand, theoretically what it means. But can you explain what green molecule is exactly, please?
Yeah. I think it's a nice, interesting term. I found it fascinating that whoever came up with it. I think of it as basically a way to move green electrons, right? That's all it is. Now, green electrons can only go on transmission lines on 220 or 33 kV lines, right? And whereas green molecules can actually be transported by conventional means and can be transported across the world, right? But it's basically I'm transporting renewable electricity in a different form. And I think that's the way I think of green molecules, right? But let's take a look at it in the context of the overall decarbonization world. So there's really two goals here. One is RE100, which is I want to go to 100% renewable energy. And India's got its own targets for that. But decarbonization can be achieved at roughly, let's call it 50% if I go to RE100. The other 50% of emissions actually come from sources that today are not mitigated by just going to renewable energy or renewable electricity. Let me put it that way. Right? It still comes from industrial heating. It comes from mobility, whether it's cars, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, buses, trucks, ships, airplanes. And of course, as I say, the industrial uses, which is really heat, right? Today, 50% of those emissions come from burning something. I burn coal, I burn natural gas, LPG, petrol, diesel, fuel oil, whatever, right? The green molecule really has a role to play in taking that other 50% of emissions and decarbonizing that to zero. So one way is to say, I'm going to electrify mobility and industrial, right? Clearly, electric cars and electric two-wheelers have a role to play. So, you can take care of that. But there are parts of mobility and industrial energy requirements that cannot be met today with electricity, right? For example, buses and trucks is a trade-off between do I actually go EV or do I actually burn something else like hydrogen, for example. And industrial heating actually require heat and electrical heating is still not there. So I still need to burn something. So then the question is, do I take renewable electricity, convert it to green hydrogen, and then burn hydrogen to provide the heat I need in a steel plant, petrochemical plant, aluminum plant or whatever. And I think that's why people are looking at that very seriously because if I have to decarbonize the entire system, I do need alternate fuels or alternate forms of energy. And green molecules really can provide that. Technically, they can provide it even today, right? Technically, if I could make all the hydrogen I could at economically reasonable costs, I can get rid of LPG to a large extent, natural gas to a large extent, potentially even diesel in trucks and buses to a large extent, right? Clearly, investments are required. I'm not trivializing the technical barriers, but the basic guts of the technology exist. However, now what we have to do is to make sure that the technology becomes more robust and becomes cost competitive all the way from producing the green molecule to using it in its end use.
Great. Just picking up on the green, molecule question and just, poking you a little bit on that. Do you really think that this is more of a PR exercise and, feel good, or is it also a way to channelize ESG funds or climate funds? People love these terms and coins and things like that when you try to tap that kind of market. So just in your honest opinion, what do you think? This is good rebranding, or this will also bring some dollars to India, or it doesn't align at all?
So I think there's two things to it. One is it's the fear of missing out, right? If everybody is talking green hydrogen, I can't be the only one not talking about it, right? I have to be A, talking about it, B, trying to do something with it, right? And part of that is if it does become commercially viable, I cannot be left out, right? I need to be able to participate. And B is, like I said, technically there's no other single solution that exists to decarbonize, I'd say 50% of the world other than green molecules, right? So, but at the same time, the economic gap that exists today between green molecules and conventional molecules, whether it's natural gas, LPG, diesel, fuel oil, is still a pretty large competitive gap. And countries around the world are trying to figure out how do you allow that gap to be met over a period of time and phase out that support so that they become competitive on their own, right? The IRA in the US, for example, which gives you fairly significant, credits and tax credits, where at least theoretically, green hydrogen is $1 a kg and conventional hydrogen is more or less the same, right? India is far from there, right? So at some point, the government has to step in either through a use mandate or through providing some nature of support. Or the corporate sector has to step in and say, yeah, the economic viability is still not there, but we will start investing slowly. The only way to bring costs down is to invest and do it, right? Because it's an experience curve. Now, if everybody sits back and says, call me when it becomes economical, it'll never become economical, right? So at some point, somebody has to take a leap of faith. And that's what the FIT regime did for renewables in India, right? I wouldn't say India, actually, anywhere in the world. It basically said, yeah, the tariffs are not fantastic if I let you lose. So we're going to make the tariffs worthwhile. But then FIT tariffs were at, I wasn't in India that many years back, 15 rupees plus, I think, in renewables, way back, a decade back. And the last auction, as I said, closed at rupee 99, right? So, but that was because the support was given, right? And you saw that improvement in competitiveness. And I think green molecules requires absolutely the same. Now, there is a lot of excitement, but I think the excitement is driven by the promise that the economics will be met one day and the hope that people are going to invest in making that happen. And I call it more than hope. I really expect that people will, but we're still waiting to see, the devil is in the detail, right? To see how the economic gap is going to be met and by whom.
On that, you mentioned that not everyone can, sit back and think that when will it become economical. Some have taken a lead. I'll now ask a question about Hero Future Energies. Are you treating with caution into all these new spaces? We have not seen very aggressive announcements from the company on all these newer sectors, green hydrogen being one example. So not here asking you to share your business secrets, but what is the strategy for a company like yours? Because you have been a conventional player. We have not seen a trend of very, very ambitious tariffs come from the company. You have had a success in a lot of projects, but what is the strategy going forward, given that the sector itself is churning itself right now?
Yeah. So we've been working on green hydrogen close to 2 years now, a little more than 2 years now. And we've done a lot of work understanding A, the technology, and understanding B, the economics. And C is we're looking at green hydrogen and potentially its derivatives along multiple use cases. So we're not restricting ourselves to, for example, I'm going to produce green hydrogen, green ammonia, and export, million tons a year, right? So that's a single value chain. We're actually looking at where all can green hydrogen go? Can it be used? What are all the different use cases? What are the economics of each? What are the technical barriers of each? Clearly we will focus on bringing a few projects online, and these are going to be more what I call pilot projects, where we invest on a small scale with a customer to use it at a customer location in the actual end use, right? So it's not going to be I build a hydrogen electrolyzer next to a solar plant and vent the hydrogen to the atmosphere, because that really doesn't address some of the technical challenges. And as and when, we look at opportunities that make economic sense, whether it's for export basis, for example, if we can find somebody who's willing to sign an offtake agreement for green ammonia, right? Would we look at green ammonia? Absolutely, right? In the meantime, we are understanding the sector, we understand the technology, understanding the economics, moving ahead with doing 1 or 2 pilot projects. I know there's been a lot of very ambitious announcements that have come, but we'll announce when we're sure we're going to do something, right? We're not going to announce ideas. We will not announce intentions. We will actually announce when there is a project, right? So I think that's kind of the approach we'll take.
Let me ask you a really big picture question, just zooming out and thinking more long term. I mean, I've seen many modeling studies that kind of show that if India were to achieve a net zero, then, you need something like 5,000, 6,000 gigawatts of solar and 3,000, 4,000 gigawatts of wind. We are really right now at, 150, 200. I mean, is it realistic for a country like India to achieve that scale? What would be some of the challenges you think to achieve that very ambitious goal? 2030 target seems still very easy when you think about 5,000 and 8,000. So what do you think would be some challenges, and what are the big opportunity areas here?
Yeah. So, no, great questions. I'll start off by, I think this McKinsey study that came out probably earlier this year or late last year, which basically said 75% of India has not been built yet, right? In other words, the economic growth that we expect in the country over the next 30 years is all new growth, right? It's all new development of infrastructure, of everything else. So India has a unique opportunity to actually build all that with sustainability in mind. So it's not a question of, I've got coal plants and, why am I going to shut it down to build renewable? It's like, no, I need a lot more power in India. So I need to build a lot more energy. Am I going to build it using coal, or am I going to do it using renewable? So whereas in more mature economies like US and Europe, it's a question of replacement, because the growth itself is a little more, I'd say, at secular levels, right? It's 1.5% to 2.5%. So the discussion there is very different. It is, I already have an infrastructure base. You're asking me to destroy it and build a new one. And then the whole question becomes, what is the return on capital? Whereas in India, we're not saying we're going to destroy what's the old. We're just saying, anyway, we have to build for the future. What are we going to build? And so the economic business case is very different in that case. Secondly, can India do it? Now, clearly, there's lots of factors that say, yes, we can, in theory. What is the solution going to look like? It's still unclear. And I think it's going to be a all of the above type solution. There's going to be large ground mounted projects, solar and wind. There's going to be offshore wind that's going to have to come. There's going to be distributed solar in a large way, both commercial, industrial, as well as residential. If we think that there's a silver bullet that suddenly magically, a million acres is going to be freed up and, we can build these 1,000 gigawatts, we know that's not going to happen, right? Because India has fairly unique challenges, not in terms of availability of land. I think the land is available, but the challenges that accompany it, right? And certainly, very logically, the sector is speaking of the best areas first, right? Let's focus Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, MP, Andhra, Karnataka, and so on. At some point, you're going to run into constraints there, and you have to then expand, right? And I think the government is doing the right thing to say, let the first expansion be offshore wind. And what are the best areas? It's offshore Gujarat, offshore TN. And I think that's the way, at least a conceptual roadmap has to be built. It cannot be very specific because we all know there's going to be twists and turns along the way. But can India do it? Absolutely. Is it going to be easy? No. Are there going to be fundamental changes needed? For example, land reform, right? I would certainly love to see that. Are there going to be fundamental changes needed in the way we invest in grid expansion and grid stability? For example, taking into account more distributed generation? Yes, I think that has to play a critical role. The good news is, I think the policymakers in India understand that, and they're not betting on one solution. They actually clearly see that it's going to take a combination of all of this. And change in a country like India is, going to take a little bit of time, right? Fundamental changes like land laws and making it a little more uniform around the country and, making it easier for industrials to access land, investments in infrastructure, whether it's be substations, evacuation or transmission. All of that is going to take time. So I'm very optimistic, very hopeful. I think the aspiration is the first part of the battle, realizing what do I need to do. Second is, do I have a roadmap that leads there? And I think that's being put together. Third is the availability of capital, both private and public. And I'd say answer is yes again there. One potential bottleneck that I see is availability of talent. Now, we think about, we're not even 100. Are we a 100 gigawatt sector yet? I don't think so, right? Not quite. No, just about there, right? Plus minus. If you're going to be a 1,000 gigawatt sector, do we have the trained, skilled manpower to do that? And I'm not talking about the manpower that goes and does the construction. It is the engineers that design plants. It is the engineers who come up with the new technologies, who maintain it. I think that could be a bottleneck, though India, again, is the single largest source of engineers in the world, right? However, are they being trained on these technologies, or are they being trained in what I call conventional engineering technologies of the past? And I'm not an expert in the education sector in India, so I'm not going to hazard a guess there. But I would really say, I think that could be a place where we start to see a bit of a bottleneck, but I'm pretty sure that will be eased as well going forward.
That is actually a great point. A lot of people do not acknowledge this. We keep talking about just energy transition and how it will impact jobs in the fossil fuel sector without realizing that there are not enough good people to employ in this sector because it's a pretty new sector, and you cannot have typical software engineers who were part of this startup revolution that came in this country. You would need a specialized expert. So thanks for raising that. Apart from that, and this is my favorite question, especially to corporates, what are these just top three of your mind? Three policy recommendations that you would like to give, which would kickstart our journey, or rather accelerate our journey towards a 500 gigawatt or a net zero or whatever comes to your mind.
So first thing I would say is policy consistency and certainty. When I say consistency, it's consistency across how it is applied across the country. Now, it is a concurrent subject and that leads to all kinds of complexity. But the issue with the private sector is I do something in Karnataka and the regulator in Gujarat sees it a completely different way. And it's the exact same regulation. So what we really need is uniform consistency across the country, right? And as a sector, we always say, give us rules that help us. And yeah, that's an ask. For me, it's more important is give us the rules that are uniform and that we can understand. That way, there's no doubt and uncertainty, because if any doubt and uncertainty in policy automatically restricts the amount of investment that goes in. Next is policy certainty. If you put something, make sure it's there for 20 years, because we invest for 25 years, right? We put all the steel in the ground and, you put the $100 million day one. If after year 5, you say, oh, the PPA is now a different PPA, right? Or now it's suddenly no longer open access because the rules have changed, right? It's too late for us to do anything because the investment has already been made, right? And you will restrict investment if people don't have visibility of what's going to happen for 25 years. Third is, now there are competing needs here, right? Which is one, we talked about security of India as a country to make sure it's integrated back into the component manufacturing and so on. But every benefit that you give one sector of the industry has repercussions and implications for other sectors, right? Do I like ALMM and BCD? I'm not a big fan of either one of them, right? Now, why do we need both of them, right? Clearly, you need to incentivize and spur industry, but all of these policy interventions need to come with a sunset date. And it should be a predictable sunset date, which is BCD is there from year X to Y, ALMM is there from year X to Y, and then after that time, compete with the rest of the world, right? And be competitive. Otherwise, prices in India are artificially high. And anytime prices are artificially high, you can see global investors look at that and say, why would I invest to get return X in India when I can go to Chile or Brazil and get a return of Y because the costs are lower, right? And so if you ask me the top three, I think these are the three, right, from a policy standpoint, that we'd really like to see if we have to get to this 500 gigawatt, 1,000 gigawatt, 2,000 gigawatt aspiration that we have.
Great. Thank you so much. Those are very concise points.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being so frank and, really articulating all the answers, also going into the basics of some of the questions I asked. So really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it and really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with a double I.